Grace and peace to you, my friends, in the name of our Lord. I hope you can join me in giving praise and honor and glory to the Lord our God, because the Lord is good and His loving kindness endures forever. His steadfast love endures forever. As always, I hope this finds you abounding in God's grace and abiding in His love and truth. So here we are. We have covered the Synoptic Gospels over the past year. It's now been a year. We have had 55 class sessions in which we've looked at some preliminary matters relative to an introduction to the Gospels, and then started giving an introduction to each of the Synoptic Gospels. So can you believe that? It's been a full year now, and we have had 55 classes. Wow. I hope it's been helpful to you, but I know I have given you a tremendous amount of material. It's just so much material to absorb, and before we go into the Gospel of John, then I think it's important that we pause and that we take time to have this review lesson, because I want you to be able to really keep in your minds a basic idea of what we've looked at for Matthew, Mark, and Luke before we then transition into the Gospel of John. And I think it will help the distinction between the Synoptics and John become even more evident if we just go back through this again and try to get it fresh in our minds to prepare the way then to move on into John. And let me just say, this has been a monumental undertaking for me. I don't recall ever working so long to put together so much material for anything that I've ever taught as I have for this class that I'm about to teach. This is a huge file. There are 98 slides in this file that we need to get to. And so I don't know how long this class is going to be, but I really hope you're watching this on double speed, that you have it set there on YouTube, that you've gone to your settings and increased the playback speed so that you can get through this in a timely way, because I suspect this is going to be a long class. But let's go ahead now, and we're going to start with Mark. I mentioned to you that I wish we had started with the Gospel of Mark. We did Matthew, Luke, and then Mark, because I thought I was then going to go into a study of Mark with you and go through a verse-by-verse study of Mark's Gospel. But that plan changed after I had already started Matthew, and so really it makes sense to review Mark. We just finished Mark, and so we needed to do a review of it. We did not review the material that we covered for it. So let's do that now. And of course, you know that I believe Mark is the first gospel, and that makes sense for us to go ahead and look at it first. And you know I like us to look at some of this classic artwork and some of the beautiful imagery that we find representing Mark and his gospel. We've used some of these images already in class, and we've pointed out that Mark is associated of the four creatures in the heavenly beings depicted in Ezekiel and in the throne scene in Revelation chapter 4. Traditionally, although we don't see any real biblical basis for doing this, but in church history, traditionally, they have been thought to represent the four Gospels. And so the creature associated with Mark is the lion. So keep that in mind. Okay, we're going to call this some quick facts to get us started at our examination of this, of our material in this review. I pointed out that Mark is, I believe, the first gospel written, and that it was written very early after the events that it records. So that's tremendously important when it comes to the authenticity of the gospel accounts. Do you remember this slide where we showed how we get from the events in the life of Christ to us, and we have the time of the actual events, and then what happened was preserved, we pointed out, in oral form and then gradually came to be written down, and that's where we get the Gospels, of course. And then it's important for us to understand, I believe in the providence of God, they were carefully preserved and copied and then finally translated, and we get from translation then to reception by us and interpretation and application. We need to spend some time there too. But here it's tremendously important to see that when we come to the Gospel of Mark, we're moving from that period of oral tradition to the first inspired written account of these events provided by the Holy Spirit. So Mark's Gospel is tremendously important for that reason. Its importance, though, was not always recognized and appreciated. In fact, we pointed out it's the least popular in church history, but it is quite popular now. It has become appreciated more in modern scholarship. It's popular especially with scholars, and I think more with the church than it used to be as well. Some other points we addressed. Some think of it as the Gospel of Peter, believing that Mark's association with Peter is good reason to think that he received most of what he writes about from Peter. It's interesting to look at his gospel from that perspective. I talked about that. I'm not so sure about that, but be aware of that. Just remember, and I can't, of course, go into depth in recalling everything that we talked about regarding these issues when we first brought them up. But his primary original audience, remember, Gentile believers. Of course, all of the Gospels written for everyone of all time, but it is important to consider those to whom it was originally addressed and how it would be received by them and why it would have certain emphases in light of those to whom it was originally directed. You'll see that especially with Matthew. Focus on Galilee, interestingly, an emphasis on the passion in Mark's gospel. Mark proportionately devotes more space to the passion than the other gospels, and so there's an emphasis on Christ's suffering. And of course, it stresses the deeds of Jesus. In Mark's gospel, he presents Christ to us more in terms of what Jesus did than what Jesus taught. Certainly he includes some of the teaching of Christ, but not as much as you find, for example, in Matthew. We see in Mark's gospel Jesus' identity in terms of what he does. Let's think about what we find in Mark's gospel relative to the other synoptics, the content relative to Matthew and Luke. When you compare Mark with the other gospels, this is a very helpful exercise. It is notable for what is not there. And here are some of those things that we do not find in Mark's gospel: birth narrative, a genealogy. We do not find a block of teaching like you have in Matthew, and you have much of it in Luke. Also, the Sermon on the Mount. The resurrection appearances, that is what is most puzzling about Mark's abrupt ending, if we take the short ending of Mark's gospel as I do, and no great commission in his gospel. Now, there's nothing to make us think that you have to have resurrection appearances and a commission to go out into the world recorded for a gospel to be a gospel. Those things are simply not in Mark's gospel. One of the most helpful things we can do when we are trying to see the distinctive portrait of Jesus in each of the gospel accounts is look at the material that is unique to each gospel. We know the Synoptics are called that because they have so much material in common, but what is unique to Mark? Well, there are several things. The parable of the seed growing secretly, that fits with Mark's emphasis on the mystery of Jesus' identity and of his reign, mysterious aspects of it that he likes to depict. Healing the deaf mute and healing the blind man of Bethsaida in stages. Those miracles both involve Jesus spitting, and Matthew and Mark avoid those. When they look at Mark's gospel and they include what they find in Mark, they exclude certain things, and those miracles are things they leave off. The sayings on salt, which are, I think, difficult to interpret, again, something about something that contributes to this mysterious way in which John wants to tell us the story of Jesus, or with an element of mystery. And then the flight of the young man, also very peculiar, only in Mark, and some think that is Mark himself, including himself in the narrative. We don't know that. It's interesting to think of that, though. Okay, let's look at why Mark wrote his gospel. Here are some of the suggested purposes, or some of the things we suggested as purposes for which Mark wrote. To proclaim the good news about Jesus, of course, but that's something he declares right in the very first verse of his gospel account. To present Jesus as the authoritative Messiah, the suffering Son of God who gives his life as a ransom. And I just want to highlight that or circle that there because that is tremendously important. Those particular points, we'll return to that, but let's mention as well to provide the church with an authoritative written record of the core facts about Jesus, right? That makes sense. But then also to define and encourage faithful discipleship. To define and encourage faithful discipleship as denying self and following Christ through suffering. If he's the suffering Son of God and discipleship means following him, then we must be willing to deny ourselves as Jesus himself did and follow him through suffering. It's evident, or I would say it's likely, that Mark was writing to those who needed to be reminded, needed to be encouraged to remain steadfast and be reminded of this aspect of the Christian life. In addition to the reasons for which Mark wrote, we talked about the overall themes. I've added that word, you'll notice there, I put that in the term overall themes, because later I realized as I put together this material from the material that I already presented that I was talking about themes, and then later we have another point called themes and theology, and so that seemed rather redundant. But what we mean here is sort of an overall theme that captures the point or the basic point of the gospel. And so, of course, it's similar to the purpose for which he wrote. It's related to that. So obviously we have overlap in these categories, but this is what we mean. That when we read Mark's gospel, we see the good news. The gospel is that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, who brings the reign of God and accomplishes the purpose of God to ransom us through his suffering on our behalf. Every term there is very important, and I worked on that for a while because it's hard to summarize and try to capture comprehensively yet concisely what the theme of any given Bible book is, and this is especially challenging with the gospel, and there are different ways to word it. There are different commentators who will word this in different ways or express it from slightly different points of view. So this is just the way that I prefer to word it, and you may have a better way to express the basic theme of Mark's gospel. And let's say themes, plural, we said the overall themes, because we're going to add here that Jesus' faithful disciples follow him through suffering to glory. And of course, that's related then to the purpose for which he wrote that we already noted. Now, what were some of the key texts that we offered? Now, once again, you'll find different expositors will give texts maybe different than or in addition to the ones that I'm offering, but I don't see how we couldn't all agree that the very first verse of John's Gospel is tremendously important, and it's quite simple and concise. The beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. A good friend of mine and faithful gospel preacher, Sam Dilbeck, I think he did a whole sermon in his series on the Gospel of Mark. He did a whole series on the book and did a whole sermon just on that verse, or used that verse and broke it down and gave a sermon on each of the key elements of that very brief and simple but important statement that Mark gives us there. In chapter 8, verses 34 through 38, when Jesus talks about what it means to follow him, to take up our crosses and follow him. Chapter 10, verse 45, where he makes it clear that the Son of Man came not to be ministered to, but to minister and to give his life a ransom. Now, Matthew will include that in his gospel. He includes most of Mark in his gospel, but I believe Mark wrote it first. And as we already noted, and we will see coming up, it's tremendously important to see that he presents Christ, declaring himself as a ransom for sin. Now, to the literary features, and you know how much I love to look at the literary features of whatever biblical text we're examining. And so let's think about that now. This is what we looked at with the Gospel of Mark. We pointed out, first of all, that his Greek is not the best. He is not concerned about telling the story with eloquent Greek and all the proper grammatical conventions. He's more interested in telling you a good story, and that's what he does. Another characteristic of Mark is his vivid storytelling, fast-paced. We saw that term euthus, the term immediately, used over and over. He uses the historical present frequently, and one of my favorite is the striking text in chapter 15:24, and they crucify him. He says it in the present tense rather than the past tense. All right. It gives us rich details that we don't find in the other accounts, and I'm including some material here from the material we already presented. I tried to find some of it, or choose some of it, and put it in smaller writing here that you can zoom in and look at on the file that I uploaded, and we won't have time to read all of that or look at all of that, but it's there for you to have in one file here in this Synoptics review. Mark uses that sandwiching technique, the intercalation that we talked about, and triads. He has groups of 3, so these are all very interesting. To those, we also added irony, both situational and verbal, and something I've mentioned already a couple of times. He presents an element of mystery, and that would include the abrupt ending. It's quite dramatic, and then it fits with that presentation of matters in a rather mysterious way. As we pointed out, that abrupt ending draws us and brings us to a point of decision. Not everyone agrees that that would be something a writer would do in Mark's time, but we addressed all of that. So now we can look at themes and theology. Themes and theology from Mark's Gospel. And we can't, as I mentioned already, we can't go into detail on all of these, but I will elaborate from time to time. But let me set these before you again and remind you. From Mark, we find this motif of mystery and secrecy, as in with the, as we pointed out several times, with the messianic secret, right? Then he presents the most negative depiction of the disciples. They're just hopelessly stupid, if I can say it that way, in Mark's Gospel. That seems a bit crude, perhaps, but they never do quite get it in Mark's Gospel. He presents them again and again as just being clueless and really struggling. And I think he's doing that because as a warning to his readers about the need to really think carefully about what Jesus has said. And there's really a cautionary tale there that Mark is presenting in the disciples' prejudices and other issues that just prevent them from doing and being and understanding what Jesus is leading them to do and to be and to understand. So we have that motif of misunderstanding that's called. It's not quite the same thing as what we were talking about earlier with the mystery or secrecy, but where we see the disciples and others who just don't get it in the story. And of course, the irony there is that the reader knows from the start. Mark's already told us from the beginning what he's doing, but he's showing how others in the account do not understand, and that it takes time for there to develop an understanding of what Jesus is saying about himself, what his works are telling us about him. The meaning of true discipleship, as we said, in terms of the cross, in terms of suffering. And then we had a great deal to say about the reign of God in Mark. But now let's look at what he tells us about the identity of Christ himself, the Christology of Mark's Gospel. Something I want to mention that I believe I failed to mention earlier when we went through the Synoptics is, and especially with Mark, we might think, well, why isn't he explicitly emphasizing Jesus' deity? And remember that this was not a great concern in the church until a later period. The Messiah was not understood, strictly speaking, as a divine being in the way that the church would finally come to understand Jesus. And so we want to be careful not to read into the Gospels the Christological controversies of later centuries. That's something to keep in view that I wanted to make sure to include, because I think I failed to mention that previously. But Mark presents Jesus as, of course, human, as man. And he gives us the most human portrait of Jesus in the Synoptics, maybe in all four Gospels, but certainly in the Synoptics. He presents to us Christ as the suffering Messiah, of course, as the Son of Man, as the Son of God, the Son of Man, identifying him as Israel's Messiah. But he's not just the Son of God, he's the suffering Son of God, and he is the one who presents himself as the ransom for many, he says in Mark 10:45. He gives his life a ransom for sins. And of course, we had a lot more to say in fleshing out all of those themes, all of those literary features and the other things that come to mind when we look at the Gospel of Mark that we addressed. But let's move on then to the Gospel of Matthew. Now, it's been a while since we looked at Matthew, and there's a lot to consider here, so I need to try to get this all in. I may have to pass by some of it rather quickly without a whole lot of elaboration. So bear with me as we now look at the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew, you'll remember, is associated with the man that we find in the heavenly creatures, or at least the face of the man, and often presented as a small angel. That's how you'll see Matthew often depicted. For example, here you see something in a mosaic that's quite typical. This statuary is tremendous, and notice that the statue of Matthew here, notice that his foot is on the bag of money, and a suggestion that he of his previous occupation as a tax collector, and perhaps then showing that he left that behind. It's under his foot, and notice how dramatic the pose is, and wow, so beautiful. Here again, you'll see what we were talking about with his association with the man and the images that we see of Matthew. He was called by Jesus to leave his occupation as a tax collector, and so that scene is often imagined and depicted, as you see it quite dramatically here in this work by Caravaggio. Actually, this is Caravaggio, and this was completed around 1599 or 1600. And notice to the right again Jesus' hand and the light coming from that direction. Matthew pointing at himself. Wow. So again, I know I'm trying to hurry, but I just have to pause for us to appreciate the beauty of these images that were inspired by these great scenes in the Gospels. What are some quick facts that we can remind ourselves of from what we looked at? Well, of course, Matthew's first in virtually all of the canonical lists that we find in church history, first in our Bibles, and really a favorite, we pointed out, in church history. And by the way, I didn't mention that Mark was not considered as important because it was thought that, well, Mark was just sort of copying from Matthew, and Mark is just an abbreviated account of Matthew, and so why look at the shorter version, go to Matthew where you're going to get all of the text? Well, as we've pointed out, that's a misguided view, I believe. Matthew has been quite influential. The teaching of Jesus that we find in Matthew and the way that he is presented in this gospel, tremendously influential in church history. Important to keep that in mind. And in part because it has some of the most powerful and familiar texts of all the Gospels. The Sermon on the Mountain, the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer. Let me see if I can zoom in on that here. I'm going to try that here. Of course, in the Sermon on the Mountain, the Beatitudes and the Lord's Prayer and the call to turn the other cheek, to love our enemies, judge not lest you be judged. He warns about wolves in sheep's clothing. Those are all terms, those are all teachings, those are all sayings that are so familiar from Matthew's Gospel. His account of the virgin birth, of Jesus being visited by the Magi as a young boy, and the blessing that the Lord pronounced upon Peter is often appealed to from Matthew's Gospel. And so that's just a small sampling of some of the beloved and familiar texts. It's important to keep in mind that Matthew's writing primarily, originally, to Jewish believers. And of course that would explain why. That's quite evident when you look at the emphases that we find in it and why he chooses to record the things that he does. The Sitz and Leben, the situation in life that apparently Matthew is writing within, the social context in which he's writing, is the conflict between the church and the synagogue, where you have Jewish believers now who think of themselves as continuing in their Jewish faith, that Christ and the gospel and the community of believers is simply the result of continuing in the law, the promises, the covenant that God has made. And yet at the same time, Jesus is bringing something new. He is fulfilling what they have been longing for and waiting for and ushering in a new day. And so there's considerable debate over whether the church is operating intramuros, you remember, or extramuros, within the walls or outside the walls of Judaism. When Matthew writes, has there been a separation from the synagogue, or do we find the Christians are still inside of that context, if you will, within the Jewish faith? Or have they made that break? And maybe you remember in class, we were talking about this. Wow, it seems so long ago when we were actually in class together, way back before COVID and all of that. But we were talking about whether a Christian at this time, those to whom Matthew was originally writing, would they consider themselves to be Christian Jews or Jewish Christians? Okay, I'm not going to go back and explain the distinction there, but we did address that in connection with these things. And so Matthew addresses the issue of the continuity with the law and the covenant, and the discontinuity. And for Matthew, that question is answered in Jesus Christ. The answer to that question is found in the person of Jesus Christ. Look at our red and green here. It looks like Christmas, doesn't it? In fact, it just happens to be Christmas time when I'm recording this. So maybe we should just pause a moment and put some lights on the tree here. Okay, yes, it just happens to be Christmas time, and that happens to be probably one of the lamest Christmas trees in the history of attempts to draw Christmas trees. Now, what about what we find in Matthew relative to Mark and Luke? And this gets us into some, as I keep telling you, very interesting aspects of the gospel and how they're distinctive. You remember this gets us into redaction criticism in the field of biblical criticism, and especially when we're looking at the Gospels. This really helps us to see the distinctive portraits of Jesus that each of the writers is providing us. So this is something we talked about at length. Well, I guess it wasn't an in-depth study by any means, but we did spend a little bit of time looking at the two-source theory, or sometimes known as the four-source theory, and that's just the idea that Mark wrote first, and that Matthew and Luke used Mark, okay? But then we have material in Matthew that we find also in Luke, almost identical, but with slight modifications in places, but often the sayings of Jesus that are identical in Matthew and Luke. And so there was some other source that we sometimes refer to as Q. And so that's the those are, I should say, the two sources when you talk about the two source theory. And it's sometimes called the four source theory because then we have also material that is unique to Matthew, okay? And that's called the M material, you remember? And then material that is unique to Luke. And so that would give us, right, the 1, 2, 3, 4. So it just depends on how you want to look at it. But it's important to keep in mind that Matthew, apparently, now this is my view of what's called the synoptic problem in dealing with the literary relationship between the synoptic gospels, that Matthew is using Mark and also a source that was common to Matthew and Luke. When we get to Luke here in a few minutes, I'll look at the chart that we introduced that shows the percentage of each gospel that, or the percentage that we find of Mark in Matthew and Luke, and the material that's unique to each one, the material that is in common. That's helpful, and we'll revisit that for just a moment or two. But here, the M material, the stuff that's only found in Matthew, and all of this material is available. I wanted to get it, though, back in this review and put it before you here. Of course, the things in the birth narrative, the genealogy that we find that begins with Abraham, different than Luke's that goes all the way back to Adam, and the birth of Jesus. But the focus, of course, in his account with the birth of Jesus is the focus is on Joseph, whereas in Luke's gospel, the focus is on Mary, right, in his birth narrative, the visit of the Magi, the flight to Egypt. But the things that we find here in the Sermon on the Mountain that relate to the law and the fulfilling of the law, what we call the antitheses, we just can't mention all of these, but the Lord's, we did already refer to the Lord pronouncing a blessing upon Peter. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed it to you, and I also say unto you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Here are some of the other things, especially the scathing denunciation of the Pharisees, and I think Matthew is collecting Jesus, the different times that Jesus rebuked the Pharisees and putting them in that powerful chapter 23. But some of these other issues here are quite interesting. The death of Judas, Pilate washing his hands, the saints, the resurrection of the saints who then go out and tell others. It's very interesting too. And it's a difficult text, and for some, they look at things like that as almost an embarrassment that you find in the Gospels. But I think that's to be understood as an apocalyptic way of saying this was an earth-shattering event that happened with the resurrection of Jesus. The guard at the tomb, and then the uniqueness of Matthew's Great Commission. All of that, and I'll see if I reduce that down. I can get it all on the screen there in one shot. I'm sorry, that may be, that you're able to pause the video and see all of that, I hope. But if you click the link down below, you'll find all of this in the files that we've already, where we've already uploaded this material. And I've talked about that before, so hopefully you can have all this material and take a closer look at it once again yourself and refresh you about these matters. Refresh yourself. And refresh yourself as well with a delicious carbonated, artificially sweetened, and chemically laced beverage. That was some of the content that you find in Matthew relative to Mark and Luke. But now let's look at the content of Matthew just in terms of the general structure of his account. Matthew is structured, you remember, around 5 major discourses that he records for us. So you have these 5 blocks of teaching around which the gospel is ordered. And I'm not going to read all of that, but I just want to at least set those before you again. One of the notable blocks of teaching is the Sermon on the Mountain. I hate to even think of something so majestic and brilliant and powerful and profound as the Sermon on the Mount as a, quote, block of teaching, but you know what I mean. And so you have the others there as well. So that's just a glance at the content of Matthew's Gospel. What's the purpose and theme? And really, as you saw when we were just looking at these matters from Mark's Gospel, these are essentially the same. You can make a distinction like we did, but we're really talking about the same thing essentially. The reason for which he's writing is going to be the theme that he presents. So, and I've got just this one statement for Matthew that I think will capture the basic theme of his gospel, and this is why he wrote, to show that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah who brings salvation history to its climax in fulfillment of Scripture. It's very important to Matthew, saving his people from their sins. So the Jewish Messiah, of course, they all present Jesus as Messiah or Christ, the Christ. But Jesus in Matthew is the one who's bringing the fulfillment of Scripture to save his people from their sins. So we'll see that as we proceed. We see it, for example, in the key text, the first of the key texts that I suggested for Matthew, and that first is chapter 1, 21 through 23. So much in there that captures the essence of Matthew's gospel, that Mary will bear a son, she shall bear a son, you remember? And you shall call his name Jesus, for he will, you have the word Joshua, Yeshua there, for he will save his people from their sins. And all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, behold, the virgin shall conceive. And then he cites Isaiah, and bear a son, they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. And we see that in Matthew, he is God with us, present in Jesus and in the person and ministry of Jesus and in the work of Jesus and what he accomplishes in the sacrifice of himself, in his resurrection, of course, all of that, but then in the church and in the authority of the church acting in his name. So at the end of the gospel, the Great Commission, very important that in Matthew's account, he begins by saying, all authority has been given unto me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore, see? So again, I know I'm going to get carried away here if I try to revisit all of these, and I don't have the text on the screen before you, so it's a little bit hard to follow some of the emphases I'm trying to make here from those passages. I've gotten used to having the visuals there before you, which is very helpful. So I'll try to limit how much I expound on these verses, but very important, those texts, very important to Matthew's gospel. Now, what are the literary features that we looked at from Matthew's gospel? Well, we looked first of all at the redactions he makes of Mark. He uses Mark's gospel, and almost all of Mark, a high percentage of Mark, is in Matthew. We'll look at that, as I said, in a moment. But what does he change from and omit when he uses Mark's gospel? What does he change from Mark's account or leave out? And by the way, I want to mention before I forget that theme I suggested of Matthew's gospel. I think some of the wording of that is taken from Strauss, from his book, Four Portraits, One Jesus. I've mentioned that as one of our sources. And this that I'm about to put here before you is from Powell and his excellent book, Introduction to the Gospels. It's the Fortress Introduction to the Gospels, Mark Allen Powell. And I made this material available to you, but I just want to put it here before you and note a couple of things from it with you. For example, he moves some of Mark's material around to suit his purposes, to craft the story in the way that he wants to craft it, the way the Holy Spirit wants it presented. And he abbreviates things. There are details and characters that are not immediately relevant to Matthew that he leaves out. As far as sophistication goes, you have a more polished Greek that Matthew uses that would reflect the educated class. So he gets rid of the historical present and Mark's repetition of, he uses over and over, and then Jesus did this, and then immediately this happened, etc., etc. And he clarifies some of the things that we find in Mark's gospel. I like this especially here. So he makes some changes that would be relevant to the community that he was originally writing to. And you notice that he'll use the circumlocution of kingdom of heaven rather than kingdom of God. These are things that we pointed out, remember. And then he changes the way major characters are portrayed in his gospel, especially Jesus. He leaves out questions that might imply to some readers that he lacks knowledge. So he leaves those questions out and things that might appear to suggest that Jesus is lacking in authority or ability on certain occasions. Those miracles I mentioned that involve Jesus spitting and using what appears to be similar to the kind of incantations or sort of elaborate rituals that magicians would use in their fake healing. And so he wants to leave that off to avoid any wrong impression that anyone might get from that. And then as far as the way he portrays the disciples, you don't have that same kind of cluelessness as you find in Mark. The theme of not understanding Jesus is adjusted so that they're not merely so nearly so slow or merely slow to understand. References to the disciples worshiping Jesus, calling him Lord and Son of God, they're added to the stories that he takes from Mark. So that's tremendously important. And it's important when you're in Mark's gospel to note that he omits those things from the traditions handed to him, apparently. And the way the religious leaders are presented in Matthew's gospel is also, what we're going to notice here, he has a very negative portrayal of the religious leaders. And as I think about what I just said a second ago, as I was trying to read that, something didn't look right in the way I was trying to present that. And so let me grab the pen here, this one right here. The theme of not understanding Jesus is adjusted so the disciples are merely slow to understand. They're not obstinate and ignorant and failing to understand. They're just slow to understand in Matthew's gospel. So there's a subtle difference there that, though subtle, is significant. Matthew's account, you remember, is highly structured. He likes numerical patterns. For example, he sets out the ancestry of Christ in 3 neat sets of 14 names. We mentioned already the 5 major sections with Jesus' teaching. He has 12 usages of that fulfillment formula that is very important to Matthew's, not just literary style, but his theology, of course. We've often pointed out how those things are related. He writes with a much more concise style than what we find in Mark, and this is perhaps a good way to think of it. You remember we said Mark writes more like a storyteller, and Matthew like a reporter. Just keep that in mind then, that Mark gives us a vivid and gripping story. Matthew is sort of like that journalist who has really ordered his material and structured it in a way that he now wants to present it in this highly organized fashion. He gives us, I think, a brilliantly arranged presentation of material, arranged carefully by topic. Now, not everyone would agree with me on this. There will be different views of this, but I think, for example, the Sermon on the Mountain isn't necessarily one sermon that Jesus gave on one occasion, but that it is a representation of what was at the core of Jesus' preaching. And so it sets out what Jesus said. It gives us in that 3-chapter summary the essence of Jesus' teaching. It's very possible that it was actually a verbatim account of a single lesson that he gave from beginning to end. I think it's more likely, though, that you find there, as you do with the denunciation of the religious leaders in chapter 23, that scorching chapter, or what Jesus says about the church in chapter 18. I think it's likely that Matthew is taking the material that he has with the sayings of Jesus carefully preserved, and he is compiling them and presenting them in a way that accurately represents and puts together what Jesus said about these different matters. So Matthew, that fits along with the idea of him being highly structured and sort of a careful reporter. He gives us a topical arrangement of themes. Here's an interesting fact that Peter is prominent in Matthew's gospel. We have additional information about Peter that is unique to Matthew. So remember, if on the test here, if on our final exam I ask you which is the gospel that emphasizes Peter, you need to know that, right? Rose, you're going to need to know that for the final, my dear sister, so keep that in mind. And Matthew gives us some unique references, a couple of unique references, explicit mentioning of the church, ecclesia, the assembly or community of God's people. Matthew's gospel is the one that mentions the church explicitly. We think of Matthew as the Jewish gospel, right? Because Jewish terms and customs are left unexplained. He gives us Israel's history as a typology, that he presents Jesus as a fulfillment of various types in Israel's history. I guess we can say it that way too. We find that use of the fulfillment formula in his account. All this has happened that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord. So that would be especially important to a Jewish audience. He gives us Christ in context of the Davidic covenant and the genealogy of David. So that's very important and very Jewish thing to do, right? The Gentiles are spoken of harshly, even though he gives us clues and outright indications of the inclusion of the Gentiles. Still, we find the term Gentile is a pejorative, essentially, in Matthew's gospel, where Jesus says, well, don't do that. That's what the Gentiles do, right? We looked at examples of that kind of thing. And yet, remember, he gives us a very harsh depiction of the Jewish leaders. Not so much the Jewish people as a whole, but the Jewish leaders are portrayed as essentially in league with the devil. And you have that infamous statement that we noted where they say in chapter 27-25, His blood be on us and on our children. Wow. And I knew this was going to be a long class, but to keep it from being too terribly long, I need to move a little more quickly, obviously, through some of these things remaining, because we've got a ton of stuff ahead for Luke. But the themes in theology now of Matthew's gospel. Here is what we gave for themes in theology, and a lot of information here that I've included. And you can zoom in if you get this file, and you can zoom in on the small text that I've provided that has a lot of extra detail and specific references that I will not read or cover here with you, but just wanted to make sure I set them before you in this review. So Matthew and the Scriptures. Let's think about his use of the Hebrew Bible. He gives us passages. When he uses the Hebrew Bible, he will show us at times that Christ is a direct fulfillment of some explicit statement, or almost explicit, a direct reference that you have to Christ, or something in his ministry or about his person and work. But then also Matthew is giving us Christ as a typological or analogical fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures. So he will use the Hebrew text in a way that, you remember, we said it goes beyond but does not contradict the intent of the human author. And I said that I incline toward the sensus plenior view, and that's the Latin for the fuller meaning view, that Christ is, as Matthew points out, Christ is filling up. He fulfills, plerao, he fulfills the meaning of these texts and of these truths and these things about Israel and about the Old Testament record. He is filling up the meaning of the text. So there's a meaning there that maybe was not understood by the original writer, but is intended by the other author of Scripture, the divine author, but that the human author didn't have in view. And we gave some important examples of that for you to consider. The most notable, Matthew 2:15. And here I've said I'm not going to mention all of these and go into them, and here I am doing that. But I suggested to you just to remember that Isaiah 7:14 can be one of these as well, where it's not so much a direct or single fulfillment, but a dual fulfillment. There's a lot to consider, a lot that we looked at under this topic. But then related to that, but going beyond that, is how Matthew views the law, Torah, which of course, Torah and covenant, central themes to Israel and to the Jewish community and their understanding and their identity. And those become important then when we understand Jesus as the fulfillment of their Scriptures, right? So we look at how Matthew presents Jesus and what the Lord says about the law and ethics in his gospel. Tremendously important. There is, we find in his gospel, a kind of tension in Jesus' teaching about the law, because there are times when Jesus appeals to the law as authoritative, and yet times when he seems to be setting it aside, where he does abrogate, or we could say, or alters the law. So it may be that Matthew wants to present Jesus as mediating between extremes of antinomianism on the one hand and legalism on the other. I hope you remember that discussion, and if not, you can go back and look at that again. Jesus claims authority. This is very important in Matthew's gospel. claims authority to interpret the law, to bind the law, to even supersede the law. And you see that in the Matthean antitheses, as they're called, and I have trouble saying that word, in the Sermon on the Mountain in Matthew chapter 5. We've reached the 1 hour mark, and we're not at Luke yet, so let's move. So then, in addition to those things, we see that Jesus claims to fulfill the law, and at the same time, Jesus stressed careful obedience to the law. In Matthew, we find that Jesus is the law's fullest expression. Very beautiful to contemplate that. I think it's a beautiful and powerful thing. Jesus is the fullest expression of the law, really, and we explained that. Jesus emphasizes the intent or the spirit of the law, the reason behind the explicit commands in the law. And Jesus stressed the motives for keeping the law. Ultimately, there we find the emphasis is on becoming like God. I'm trying to find my Zoom feature here and I'm having trouble grabbing it there. Jesus gives the motives for keeping the law, and that we find ultimately we are to keep the law in order to reflect. You remember in Matthew's gospel that keeping the law reflects the character of God. It's a matter of being like God. And still further, we find that Jesus gives the hermeneutical framework for interpreting God's law, for prioritizing His commands. Wow, what an important area to consider and to study and to contemplate and to try to understand. And so we gave a lot of examples of this that I'm going to put up here before you. And this is a review, and so you're going to have to do a lot of that reviewing. But I just want you to remember that here you find Jesus talking about in Matthew's gospel the weightier matters of the law. You see, that's a prioritizing. And there are references to the law and the prophets that are unique to Matthew, where Jesus talks about what is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. So those texts, all very important. Here you find a couple of cases unique to Matthew where Jesus says that he quotes from Hosea, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. So all of that, tremendously important and unique to Matthew's gospel. Wow, look at what the Lord is giving us in Matthew's gospel about the law and ethics. But going then still further in these themes in Matthew, we find righteousness is a key idea that he talks about. And in Matthew's gospel, it's about doing what God requires, not just outward appearance. The authority of Christ and His church is, I think, an important emphasis in Matthew's gospel, and we looked at that and gave those passages there. And then, of course, Matthew talks again and again in his gospel. He presents Jesus talking again and again, especially in the parables, about the kingdom of heaven. That's the language that's used in Matthew's gospel. And then to these we'll add two more, judgment in hell. More said about hell and that expression, weeping and gnashing of teeth, more in Matthew's gospel than anywhere else. And despite the emphasis on the law and the Jewishness of Matthew's gospel, still we find that he is pointing toward the ultimate inclusion of the Gentiles and how Christ has come to the nations. Now, that's not going to be the same emphasis you find, there won't be the same emphasis on that you find in Luke, but we talked about some of the hints of it in Matthew's gospel. We move from that then, the last category for each gospel, the last one we looked at for each gospel is the Christology. But of course, much of what we're seeing in the literary features and in the themes in theology is Christology. So let's just make this qualifier here. Let's give this qualifier that this is, of course, in addition to what we already see about the person and identity of Christ in the previous material. So, Matthew presents Jesus as the Son of David, the Davidic king, Mashiach. He is, the Greek term would be Christos or Christ. He is the Messiah of Israel. Of course, the Jewish gospel, we would expect that emphasis, right? And that he's the fulfillment of Old Testament types. That in Jesus we see the true Israel, the son that Israel failed to be, and the true Israel that the people of Israel failed to be, the new Moses. We talked about the way in which we can see that in Matthew's gospel. Let me encourage you to again, look at the file and some of the extra material that I've written in here with much smaller writing to provide some passages and some elaboration and examples and such. But of course, all the Gospels present Jesus as the Son of God, but there's a special emphasis on that in Matthew's Gospel and the linkage of that with his identity as Messiah, the linkage of Jesus as the Christ with the Son of God. And that might mean that, or that might be intended by Matthew to suggest both the transcendent aspect of his being and then also his mission. So both his mission and his person, we might think of it in that way. And we mentioned that bolt out of the Johannine blue. We don't have time to go back and look at that again, so I'm just going to reference that and you can take a look at that. And then he's the Son of Man in Matthew's Gospel. Of course, we said already that he's presented in Mark's Gospel as the Son of Man, but you'll notice these references that I give here show that Matthew clearly wants to include that and the linkage with Daniel and what Daniel the prophet said about Messiah as that Son of Man who comes with the glory and the clouds of heaven to receive the kingdom. And so sometimes people look at Matthew's gospel as the one that presents Jesus as the king, and that would fit with that idea. But my dear friends, I need to stop here. Let's take a time out. As I've been saying all along in this study, the plan was to just continue on and look at the Gospel of Luke, review what we said about Luke, and in fact I did that. I finished the whole class, but it turned out to be over 2 hours long, about 2 hours and 4 minutes long, and so I decided to break it up into part 1, part 2. I just feel like not a lot of people are going to sit down if they see that this is a 2-hour class and work their way through the entire class, even on double speed. And I just feel like that's a little bit overwhelming, and it makes more sense to divide it into 2. In fact, I was worried I may have already lost some of you. Maybe some of you already dozed off in this very long review class that we've been having. And I realize, of course, that you can pause it at any time and take a nap and come back to it later, or watch it again on another day and finish it up. But still, when even the cat is dozing off, I'm worried that things have gotten too long. When there's not a creature stirring anymore, not even a mouse, when even the mice have dozed off at the keyboard, maybe it's time to stop. So we've looked at Mark, we've looked at Matthew in our review. We still have now to look at Luke. And yes, we covered so much material from the Gospel of Luke that there is still a whole nother hour just to look at all that we said, just to sort of summarize and run through all that we said about the Gospel of Luke. I know this seems really long, but if you think about it, if I've calculated properly, we're trying to review and summarize over 40 hours of class time. That's how much time we've spent going through Mark, Matthew, and Luke. So I guess a couple of hours really doesn't seem too bad after all. Not too terribly long when you think of the sheer volume of material. I know I've overwhelmed you with so much material, and that's why I wanted to have this review and have it all in one file for you. If you want to just continue on and take that second part, come back later, look below in the information box. Check that little box or tap that box to open it up and see, and I'll put a link there once I get the second part uploaded. I'll put a link there if you want to continue on. Otherwise, I will post it next week for our Bible class next Wednesday. But since it's already done, I can post it early in the day, and you can take it any time next Wednesday. I know I was late getting this one up because of some technical problems and some other matters, so I apologize for that, but I'm glad the material is there. So, until then, may the Lord bless you and keep you. I look forward to seeing you again, Lord willing. God bless. And let me leave you then wishing you peace, wishing that the Lord would bless you and keep you. That is my prayer for you. God bless.